basically what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to add one more scripture, which has been lingering for the last few weeks with me. It's from the end of the reading last week, where John the Baptist's father is praying and says, "By the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the way of peace." It's guiding our feet in the way of peace that is our gentleness, that we need to figure out how to live in this world. And it begins, as Zechariah says, with God's tender mercy. God's reaching out to Israel, establishing a relationship. Moreover, it's that relationship that will make possible the way of peace in this world. For that is what we need in this world, violent in those days and violent in ours. And in this third week of Advent, God starts to give us some very explicit instructions as to how we will build this way of peace. So Zechariah's son John gives the details, as Anne just read. Details that sadly are just as relevant today as they were back in the first century, with bribery, violence, practiced by people in government who should know better. All this is still going on. But there's a funny thing in that passage, John the Baptist speaking. There's nothing particularly religious about John's commands. They stand as good common sense ethics, something everybody, Jew, Christian, Muslim, secularist, might agree upon. So why do we need more? Why do we need all this religious stuff to tell us that we basically know what we should be doing anyway? We need it because there is a great gap between our desires for peace and our abilities to attain it. Paul was pretty good about this in Romans, saying how difficult it is to do what we know we should. Yes, God turns to us in his tender mercy, but our turning back to him, that's the difficult part. And that's where the Bible comes in, what our Bible is all about. It teaches us how we can make this turn, how we can build this way of peace. General ethics, however much we agree upon them, have to be realized in particular places, in particular communities. We've been studying a wonderful book of biblical theology, which I can't get away from. It's called Not in God's Name by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. It's just a beautiful work of biblical theology, explicating very great detail how the Bible teaches us to build this road of peace. And his treatment of that begins with the realization that we have an inherent tendency towards violence. Call it what you will, original sin, or in Sacks's more biological take, our innate tendency to form groups, communities which are strong within, but who, as kind of the flip side of that, are deeply mistrustful of those outside the group. That is simply natural. We evolve that way, and so that's where the Bible begins. It takes us as we are. But, and here's the key point, it doesn't stop there. The point, the gift of God's tender mercy, is that we are blessed, saved, removed from ourselves, if you will, moved above our natures. Though the Bible never denies our natural selves, it works with it. Though for a long time the church sadly sought to just extinguish what we are naturally. But the way of peace is built when, with God's help, we address our innate tendency to violence. This is the story that Sacks tells in his close reading of Genesis, which is really the story of humanity learning to overcome its inherent violence. It begins with original sin. No, not Adam and Eve and that pleasant little story, but Cain's slaying of Abel in a religious context. Violence, and even worse, violence in the presence, indeed in the name of God. But from the very beginning, God tells Cain and our natural selves, yes, sin is there, crouching, waiting for you. Sin and violence will always be there, but God promises that with his help, we can overcome it. And that's what we are here to do, to overcome that urge, to build the road of peace. That's what we read about in Genesis. That's what the Baptist teaches us today. But it's more than just teaching. It's a process. It's a history, because we don't know how to do it. Again, with Paul, we want to do what we know we should, but we flounder. And God instructs us slowly and very gradually over time. God builds this way of peace. It begins with Abraham. And from the beginning, we see that it will be hard. Abraham has 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And like Cain and Abel, there is tension. But this time, it does not result in violence. Though Ishmael is almost abandoned in the desert. But we are beginning to learn. And after Ishmael and Isaac come Esau and Jacob. And again, violence is a very real possibility. Indeed, Jacob flees from Esau. With the revelatory moment comes when after very many years, they meet up again. And Jacob is, he's ready to suffer his just deserts at the hand of Esau to get what he deserves. But, wonderfully, Esau hugs him and forgives him. Violence is averted again. The two, Jacob and Esau, ultimately gather together and are there at the death of their father when he passes away. And finally, Genesis culminates with the story of Joseph, almost killed by his brothers, sold into slavery. Again, a very violent beginning, and again, an ultimate resolution for peace. And after the reunification, a stronger family, now based upon the conscious realization of a great sin and the taking of personal responsibility in the case of Judah for the overcoming of that sin. As the Bible, Genesis sums it up for us, Joseph speaking, "As for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save many people." That is precisely how God works, through the historical experiences of you and me and of his people. Again, why do we need that? Why all this stuff? Sachs sums it up very nicely after telling some of these stories. And I'll read that. Intimated here is one of the most striking themes of the Pentateuch. God chooses those who cannot do naturally what others take for granted. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all promised the land of Canaan, Israel, own none of it, and have to beg or pay to bury their dead, pitch their tent, or draw water from wells they themselves have dug. Moses, bearer of the divine word, is the man who says, "I am not a man of words. I am slow of speech and of slow tongue." Israel is the people whose achievements are transparently God-given. What for others is natural, for Israel is the result of divine intervention. Israel must be weak if it is to be strong, for its strength must come from heaven, so that it can never say, "My power and the strength of my hands have achieved this wealth for me." That's from Deuteronomy. It is Ishmael's natural strength that disqualifies him. So there's a whole narrative going on, beginning in Genesis, of the overturning of our natural impulses in our learning to be people who depend on God, or to put slightly differently, to be a people of peace, to be a gentle people. We overcome our violence with God's help. We begin to build the road of peace, a road that required that Israel experience this, internal family violence first, and Israel then had to go through all kinds of the experience of political violence into Egypt, where, again, as we just saw, paradoxically, they were saved. They came out of Egypt, having been a slave people, became a transformed people, a people on the way of peace, we might say. But that way could not begin without the very intimate, close experience of that all the patriarchs went through, of overcoming the violence that was inherent in their nature. This is not, as you can see, and this is why the Bible is so important, it's not a general schoolhouse learning. It's not something that you can simply read in a manual of ethics and go out and do. It has to be experienced within families, within nations, within cultures. And that's why we need this long story of the Bible as this peaceful road is inculcated and taught into us. It's learned in the heat of everyday life. Sarah and Hagar fighting, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and Judah. This is how we learn about ourselves. And the story does not end in Genesis. It continues. The way will move through the kingdom of Israel, to the exile in Babylon, and today's story to the banks of the Jordan River and the preaching of John. The careful overcoming of violence that we saw in the patriarchal and matriarchal stories continues now in John and the one whom John announces. Jesus is born into the violence of the Roman Empire. We will watch how Jesus will work to overcome that violence, how Jesus will further take us on this road of peace. He will do things both that share a kind of genetic relationship with the stories we read in Genesis, but that will go deeper and more profoundly on this road to peace. And there we can begin to think about, although I won't today, this whole notion of pacifism. That comes at the end of a very long road. Pacifism had to be learned. It's one of the amazing things in this Sachs book that he pretty much draws that whole story out of Genesis. And the remarkable thing is, I can't wait, I haven't quite finished yet, to see then how one can apply, Jesus to this, since that's obviously not Sachs' interest in the book, but it's right there for the plucking, if you will. So I guess what I'm saying is, though, there's another side to this. We cannot even begin to know Jesus unless we know Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. The building of the road of peace is not made of vague intentions. It's made of particular stories and particular lives. We might think of the image of the road with differently shaped rocks, pebbles, having names, having histories. It can't be built without the particularity that each one of us brings to this group. And if we blow that up throughout history, we share this road, this building, through communities, through time, through those people we've read about in Genesis, to those we read about in our Anabaptist past. All these is essential. And it's scary today as we see religion so often generalized to very, either kind of sophomoric little wisdoms of this or that, or boiled down to a pointless question, do you believe in God? That doesn't make any difference. It's how you act that belief in God, what that belief in God means, that we need. And that needs to be nurtured with communities that read, study, celebrate the gospel that we have here. So in the story that we've just read from Luke, John announces the coming of one who he's not even fit to untie his sandals. Jesus, the final chapter in this story of peace in our world. I began by saying that John teaches us a prophetic ethic, if you will, a universal ethic. So what does Jesus add to this? Jesus, and we can only begin to suggest some things here, Jesus takes up this history of violence into himself. He is the ransom for the many, taking upon himself the story of Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, all the kind of pain and working out that's going on there, somehow Jesus brings into himself. The miracle, if you will, of the incarnation and the atonement is all the culmination of this story that I've been talking about. And all this comes summed up in Jesus, where God says once again to all of us, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And that's what we need to figure out, how we live out that very paradoxical statement.